Alright, let's see what we got. E4, E5, B4. Okay, unconventional opening. Perhaps we will see the signature spider web out of Truplaya. Knight F6. C3, okay. This is not the traditional spider web we see. Normally we see E3 instead of E4. And the pawn was left undefended, so it is taken by black. White does have a couple options. Could play something like D3 to kick the knight away. F3 is a possibility, but you usually don't want to play F3 because it opens up your king if you decide to castle on that side. Bishop D3 is also a possibility. Let's see what white decides to do. F3, okay. So this could be interesting. If white opts not to castle, we might see the king stay in the center of the board and the rooks come to the middle. It's not always a necessity to castle if you're on the offensive. If you always get tempo, you don't need to castle. We see knight G5. And this is interesting, you know, we are seeing white pushing a lot of pawns, getting a lot of central control with the pawns, and black has moved this knight 3 turns in a row. Not a lot of piece development. It can be dangerous. 4 turns in a row even. Of course, it was taking white's knight, so it's more reasonable. So we get knight h3, knight takes h3, g takes h3. We get d5, rook g1, developing the rook. We get e4. Black's trying to push the pressure on these isolated pawns from white. And man, these moves are just getting blitzed out. I don't know if the players know this, but they do have a lot of time to play. Both of them have a pretty significant amount of time. Oh, they're also playing correspondence, so there isn't even a time limit. Perfect. So, move 8, we have c6, bishop a4, and bishop takes on h3. We now have f takes on e4, and this pawn chain from black might be collapsing. So we have queen h4 check, and now the king has to move forward. This is why it's really dangerous to open up the king side. Your king can come under attack very easily, and now the king is stuck in the center of the board. Black now has 2 pieces eyeing down these diagonals, potentially attacking white's king. And in fact, there we go. Queen takes e4. Where can the white king go? Only one square. f2. And now all black really has to do is start moving pieces towards the king. The king has no squares to go. Well, I suppose it can go to g3, but it would run the risk of coming under attack with something like queen g4. Besides, moving your king multiple turns in a row is not very effective. But if black is worried about that, could just play bishop d6. Then the queen, or the king rather, would truly be trapped. Instead, opts to play queen f4. And if white goes back to e2, we could see a repetition, which would lead to a draw. Instead, goes for the queen trade. Unconventional. Down 2 pawns, so trading queens isn't necessarily the best, but when you're under attack like this, getting pressure off of your king can be very effective. Usually when you're on the offensive, you don't want to trade away your attacking pieces. So white is trying to strengthen up his defense by getting rid of the opponent's offense. Very reasonable. But, of course, black decides not to trade queens. Why would he? He has no reason to. Queen takes h2, taking another pawn. Black is up 3 pawns. And now white is unable to defend his rook with his king if he moves away, so he moves his rook up. If black ends up trading down, black will end up trading a bishop for a rook, which is not the worst, because he's also up 3 pawns. And they're all passed pawns. 3 passed pawns chained together. Very dangerous position for white. But who knows, maybe black has another idea. Maybe there's some way he can continue the attack. Queen to h1. Attacking this bishop. Potentially getting ready for something like bishop d6 to continue the attack. Maybe going to castle, bring the rooks in. Who knows? Either way, white is not in a very favorable position. That much is clear. But it's not over yet. It's not over yet. If white can manage to develop his pieces, bring them to the center, or get some material back. But of course, the bishop is defending this. So it is not exactly super favorable. However, important to note, if black takes this rook, the queen is left undefended. It would be a massive blunder. Black might still be able to win the game, but down a queen, white would be happy. White would be very happy to take that queen. So the best move is to trade queens and then take the rook. Perhaps there's another option, but it's not immediately obvious if there is one. And black's spending a lot of time. Remember, the time control was altered for this game because both players decided to have no time constraints. Black actually plays h2, so not even abusing the fact that the rook is under attack. So white just gets a pawn for free. If white decides to go back rook g2, it'll be the same position except he's up a pawn. This could end up being favorable for white. Still a very tough position because the king's in the center of the board, but white doesn't really know how to capitalize. Now white is taking some time to think. He knows that the rook is under attack and that his king's in check. And he likely knows that if he goes back, it can be taken by the white bishop, or the white colored bishop, white squared bishop, right? Still, very dangerous position, but he does bring the rook back. Probably the only move. Otherwise, the rook just gets taken by the bishop. Now, what will black decide to do this time? Queen h1 again doesn't seem like the best move. Could lead to some kind of a repetition. It's difficult to say. Black does end up taking the rook though, with the bishop, and we expect that the white queen may end up taking this bishop and the black queen may be traded back. If that is not the case, then the rook is taken for free, which seems favorable for white. White's taking his time. Wants to make sure that the position is solid before trading off the queens. It is the best move though, according to the engine. And white does not decide to trade. Instead plays queen f6. Now, this is where you will find a very interesting tactic called a discovered check. So, if black moves the bishop on g2 out of the way, the queen is now attacking the king, meaning the king is in check. So, this bishop can attack one of the enemy pieces or just move to a better position, and white isn't really able to counter it. We'll see if black manages to make use of this discovered check. Or perhaps he just wants to develop his rook. Remember, the rook is under attack by the queen. So if black doesn't make a very meaningful move, white can start to get his material back. Still dangerous, but comeback is possible. And black does just move the rook. Not a terrible move. Continuing to try and apply pressure. If black is able to develop this rook, it'll be more pieces attacking the white king. White plays d3, maybe trying to develop the knight. Knight to d2 could be coming soon, or developing the bishop. Maybe he wants to attack the queen by moving it to f4. Bishop f4, the queen's now under attack. Also, remember, bishop to e4 in this position. White cannot take the bishop because the king is in check. Of course, white can go to king e3 and then defend the pawn, but it may not be happening. So, black ended up going b5 instead, and white brings the bishop back to d1. We now get knight to d7, attacking the white queen. We'll see if white is able to find a safe spot for the queen that also manages to defend his king. There aren't actually that many squares that the queen can go to. f3 is protected by the bishop, e5 is protected by the knight, e6 by the pawn. Not a lot of safe squares for the queen. Queen takes on c6, trying to get some material back, but leaving his king very exposed. The only pieces protecting the king are the two bishops eyeing these diagonals. They are very strong pieces, but when your king is in the center of the board, being attacked by the queen, bishop, the rook, potentially this knight, and maybe this other bishop if it's able to develop. It's very scary, very worrying. However, this knight is being pinned by the queen. The knight cannot move because the king would then be in check. And there we go, the discovered check. Bishop to h1, the queen is checking the king, and it doesn't have many safe squares to go to. Well, I suppose it does, but the queen and the rook can easily attack it wherever it goes. Still, white has managed to hold on. And if he can stabilize this position, maybe get his king somewhere safe, like to b3. Perhaps king to b3 somewhere along the way. Could actually be an okay position for white. So we get king e3, d4. The king is once again in check. The pawn takes. Alright. And now we get bishop taking the queen. So there is not a lot of hope left for white in this game. Down 14 points of material. King is in the center of the board. Not a lot of escape squares either. Queen is covering the second rank. The two pawns are actually blocking the king from getting away. It's very dangerous. We get knight d2. Bishop takes on b4. One less square for the king to move to. But we do get the bishop developed to b3. Applying pressure along this diagonal, maybe looking at taking the f7 pawn if the king moves. But of course, black doesn't care. Black's just going to keep attacking the white king. King doesn't have many squares to go to. Not many squares at all. We get knight f3. And this game could be over right here, right now. Rook takes f3 is checkmate. There are a few two-move checkmates according to the engine. Though one of them relies on the move rook takes f3 being played. If you would like to view the game, you should click on the Lichess link, and then it will take you to the game. We actually get bishop takes f3, so not opting to go for the checkmate just yet. White's life has been extended, but still not many places to go. Bishop takes f7 does prolong the game, and it is white's best move as a result. But of course, losing a bishop for a pawn is not ideal. Though we'll see if black decides to take it with the king. He is thinking. Maybe he has other plans. And he doesn't take it. He goes king to f8. Perhaps worried that if he takes it, his king might come under attack. Who knows? Bishop a3. And bishop takes that a3. That was the anticipated move from black. And we'll see what happens now. Black does, of course, have another discovered check by moving the bishop away from f3 whenever he decides to do that. And he can in fact get it right now, taking the white bishop, getting a discovered check in the process. What will be black's decision? Sometimes you have too many ways to win the game, and it isn't always obvious which one to pick. queen takes instead. The rook to f1, attacking this bishop, or perhaps just pinning the bishop. The discovered check is no longer available to black, because if the bishop is moved, the rook will be checking the king. Now we now see the consequences of black's earlier action of not taking this bishop earlier, or not running the other way. If black had gone to d8 rather than f8, he would not be in this position. What will black do in response? Could simply try to move the king out of the way. After all, there are two defenders on this piece, meaning even if the rook does take, the queen can take, and the rook is defending the queen. So it's not necessarily dangerous for the bishop, not at risk of losing the bishop, but still, it can't move. Queen g5, another check, forcing the king to move away. And now the king is actually blocking the rook from attacking the black king. White can safely move the light squared bishop away if he desires. But this game it's getting interesting. Black has had some difficulty converting this position, and white has been able to hold on. If black makes one mistake, going for a check that leaves one of his pieces unprotected, something like queen d2, the king can then take the rook on g3. But white does just move the bishop away to a safe square, blocking those double pawns so they cannot become queens. We now get king to e1, checking the black king, and knight to f6, blocking the rook. Important, the queen is protecting the knight, so white cannot just take it. Rook f2. Purpose of this move could be to get off of the white squares, since the light squared bishop is a very powerful piece in this position. And now we get rook e8, checking the white king, forcing it to move away. King d1. This rook is now unprotected, so if it can somehow fall under attack. And there we go, it is now attacked. But that left the knight unprotected. The black king is now in check. There are a few safe squares he can go to. The bishop drops back to protect and block. Now, it could just be up to the rook and queen to checkmate the white king. Rook a6, attacking this bishop. Maybe the white king will run up to a4. We get queen takes on d3.
Jesus.
Checkmate.
My brain's